Well, I was listening
fan
to
shirt.
Danny and Dusty yesterday, and they were talking some Big Ten football. And it was an interesting conversation. They were talking about really the most interesting aspect of these West Coast teams joining the Big Ten, and that is just the style differences.
Yeah.
And how cool that's going to be to see, what that does to the Big Ten, how the Pac-12 teams adjust to the Big Ten, and how the Big Ten teams adjust to the Pac-12 team. I mean, Dan Lanning said it. He came out and he said, look, the Pac-12 has the skill guys
Mhm.
and the quarterbacks. The Big Ten has the big hog mollies. I believe he called them fatties.
I don't think that's what he said.
No,
but...
he didn't. And then the SEC has both. The SEC has it all.
And that's why the SEC is the best conference.
And that's what he said. And so it is true, like when you think of Big Ten football, you think of big fronts.
Yeah.
And
bad weather in November, running the football.
Running the football. So then
Iowa punts.
So I was listening to Danny and Dusty talk about this, and I got to thinking, and as I was driving in my car, and I thought, wow, what if Oregon goes in there and just like I kept thinking about the Civil War a couple years ago, where Oregon State basically said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to run the ball, and then we're going to run it again, and then we're going to run it again. And then we're going to run it again and again and again and again. We're never going to throw it, and we're going to come back from 80 down and beat you. Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
Well, I got thinking about that going, oh, my God, Oregon State and that team, in fairness, they had a really good run game and a really good offensive line. But they basically Big Ten'd the S out of Oregon to win that Civil War game.
100%.
And so I thought, well, is Oregon really ready for this? So I had to go do some digging on some numbers.
Sure.
Okay. And the answer to the question, is Oregon ready for the Big Ten, is very likely yes. Because I was going back to what Oregon State did to Oregon a few years ago, just running it down their throat. And then I was thinking about Michigan last year and how Michigan beat Penn State. Basically, J.J. McCarthy didn't throw the ball in the second half.
Yeah.
They just said, hey, we're just going to run it down your throat. Stop it. Well, I looked up Penn State. They had the number one rush defense in the nation last year.
Mm-hmm.
The number one rush defense in the nation. And Michigan just said, stop it. You cannot stop our run.
No.
That's crazy.
Well, and also, too, that you're able to do that when the other team can't score. Like, there's two components to that. Yes, running the ball down someone's throat is grand and bleeding clock, but you also have your defense bow your back. So, if you're trying to run the ball like that, but you're trailing by 10 points in the game, that doesn't work. That's the Iowa thing. When Iowa's able to drag you into a slugfest, great, but Iowa also gets their ass kicked when the other team can score against you. So,
well, they have a good defense, though.
And that's why Michigan won a national championship, is Michigan's offense was there when they needed it. We saw that. We saw that in the first half against Washington.
But I think with Iowa, I think that's the fun part about watching these West Coast schools in the Big Ten, is how will those offenses look again consistently week in and week out against the Iowas and the Michigans and the Wisconsin defenses.
Yes, absolutely.
It's going to be awesome. But then on the other side, so I was looking at that. Penn State had the number one rush defense in the country. They got torched by Michigan's run, but you're right. They also couldn't move the ball. The second fun fact I looked up was, do you know who the highest ranked Big Ten team in rush yards per game was last year? Because you think of all they do is run the ball.
Yeah, I would assume Michigan. I mean,
it was not.
It wasn't?
No. It was Nebraska, and they were 34th in the country.
That was the best rushing attack, huh?
Yes, in the entire league.
Well, that surprises me a bit.
So this idea that the Big Ten, oh my God, the rushing attacks, it wasn't that wasn't the case last year. Fun fact number 3 is that Oregon last year would have been 3rd in the Big Ten in rush offense. They were ahead of Michigan.
Wow.
Oregon was.
I wouldn't have necessarily thought that, but Oregon, and that's the other one I think that is a misnomer about Oregon over the last handful of years. Dude, Oregon runs the ball. They ran the ball into Mario Cristobal. They certainly run it under Dan Lanning.
Well, they do, but again, I think there's a difference between running the ball in the Pac-12 and running the ball in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
That's the whole fun of this.
Yeah.
So the last fact is CBS Sports did a ranking of each unit in the Big Ten. Do you care to guess who has the number one offensive line in the Big Ten this year?
I'm guessing Oregon.
It's Oregon.
Yeah.
So the idea of, is Oregon ready for the Big Ten because of, the big offensive lines, the big defensive fronts, running the football? The answer is yes.
Yeah, it is.
They're 100% ready, which is why they're picked to be second to Ohio State in the league.
And most people are picking Ohio State to win a national championship. And I mean, both teams, by the way, are picked to make the college football playoff. And that's something that they've talked about with Lanning when people say, and I totally get it. Again, why is Lanning being considered as one of the elite coaches? He hasn't won anything, and those are all totally fair. It's more of, I think people look at what he took over and what he's building, especially along the lines. Their defensive line and their offensive line are both going to be really good.
Yeah.
And they've killed it in the transfer portal at both of those spots to fill in, and then they've recruited really well.
Well, but this is the fun of going to the Big Ten, is that while their offensive line and defensive lines are both really good, they had Oregon the number 1 offensive line in the Big Ten. They had Oregon the number 4 defensive line in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
The beauty of it is they will be tested by 2 of the better offensive lines and defensive lines in the country in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
When they play Ohio State, well, actually, the Michigan game is really, we're kind of overlooking that game because everybody wants to talk about Ohio State coming to Eugene.
First, and it's in Eugene, yeah.
But that Michigan game, November 2nd, at the Big House, is the number 1 offensive line versus the number 1 defensive line.
Yeah.
That's Oregon's offensive line against Michigan's defensive line. Dude, that is going to be a battle.
And I know it's not the same group because so many left in the NFL, but I think we all remember Michigan's defensive line just absolutely hammering both Alabama and UW in last year's playoffs. I mean, that line was really, really special. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun, but I just don't think that Oregon is going to get overwhelmed. I know some people are like, well, Oregon's going to lose 4 games, and it's a rude awakening. I think they'll be fine.
Well, I don't know about overwhelmed. They have too much talent to be overwhelmed, but I do think it will be an interesting transition with the styles of play in this league and the weather as the season progresses to see how Oregon handles that.
It is true. Like we always talk about the only real place that's problematic is early in the season in Arizona. Those are hot, but those are always night games. But it's hot playing down in the desert early in the season. And then there's only one treacherous road trip, and that is late in the season up in Pullman. And the Big Ten is littered with those. If you think Pullman in November is hard, wait till you go to Camp Randall. And you go to some of these other places. So, I mean, Michigan, late in the year, it will be a different style. And again, that's where it comes in. It behooves you to be physical. And I think that's the idea in the Big Ten. It's the same thing when you play, in some of the northern cities in the NFL. You have to be able to be physical and run the ball because throwing the ball is challenging late in the year. And I think this Oregon team is uniquely built to hit the ground running, as opposed to maybe some of the other versions of it. Because it may be known as a real flashy kind of, like hive. What did you say? Like, it's all flash, no substance. But when you look at the history of Oregon, look at their old linemen and the running backs that they have produced over the last 15 years.
Well, I think too that's gotten a lot better.
Yes.
With Lanning.
Yes.
Lanning comes from the SEC. He
knows,
and it's been building. But when Chip had this thing rolling, they're way better in the trenches now than they were then.
Yes,
and that's part of part of. You got to give Cristobal
credit,
some credit for that,
because
Lanning has built upon that.
Yes, Cristobal came in and said specifically, dude, we need to get better up front, because he also came from the SEC.
Yeah,
and Lanning has built upon.
And he was an offensive lineman. He recruited some offensive, but Lanning has added to that, and they are just way better suited against the big boys of college football now than they ever were.
Yes,
which is why everyone has such faith in them. But I just think it's going to be interesting, the week in and week out stuff. It's like, Ohio State, Michigan, but you also play at Wisconsin. Illinois, Maryland. I'm not saying these teams are going to beat you, but look, even in the Pac-12, you would have close games. They played a close game with Washington State last year.
Yep.
Is that any different than than Illinois?
Well, and we've had this conversation with Joey. We can go back and forth on which one is the tougher run, and now you kind of get to see it, right? Like you don't get to see Arizona, you don't get to see Utah, but you do get to see Wisconsin, and you get to see, Purdue, or you get to see Illinois or Northwestern, or any of these schools, and it'll be interesting to see how this goes. I am really excited to just see just see different teams.
Yeah, it's the styles.
The styles.
That's the fun of it,
Yeah.
I think, is the styles make fights, and just the flash and the skill of the Pac-12 meeting up with and marrying the big fronts of the Big Ten and the little bit more smash mouth physical football.
Yeah.
It's going to be awesome.
And by the way, if Wisconsin goes, because you're in Wisconsin, if Wisconsin, bullies you around, then that's going to be a bit of a wake-up call. And by the way, that very well could happen.
But that's later in the year.
It's later in the years. That's what I'm saying. Maybe that does happen. And then you have to take a step back and be like, man, we need to reevaluate that, which is why it's so fun going into the season, because there's so many unknowns. We just don't know how the stylistically these things are gonna line up.